Today we are diving into a high-stakes business battleground, Africa. Indian and Chinese businesses are both making significant moves in the continent of Africa, each aiming to secure market share, resources, and influence. But how are Indian businesses faring against their Chinese counterparts in Africa? And are they able to compete effectively?
As a Congolese, every time I read Made in China, my mind tells me this is fake. And when I see Made in India, it tells me this is original.
Let's explore as to how Indian companies and businesses are taking on Chinese businesses and what does it mean for Africa's future. Africa is a massive continent, rich in resources and home to over 1 billion people. It's projected to become one of the largest consumer markets in the world for growing demands of everything, right from infrastructure to consumer goods to healthcare. For both Indian and Chinese businesses, this represents a huge opportunity. However, these two countries are taking very different approaches in Africa. While Chinese companies are known for their aggressive investment in infrastructure and state-owned projects, Indian businesses, on the other hand, are focusing on local partnerships and sustainable growth.
Nigeria has secured nearly $14 billion in pledges from Indian investors for various sectors, including steel, petrochemicals, power generation, and defense.
At first glance, these investments might seem unusual. But if you observe carefully, these investments are part of a carefully calculated move by India, not only in Nigeria, but in the whole of Africa. If you zoom out on this map, you'll see India is adopting a similar strategy in other African countries like Kenya, Uganda, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, Ghana, Mauritius, Egypt, Togo, and Mali. Now, the obvious question is why? Why is India willing to commit such a massive amount of resources into Africa?
Before we move forward, please do consider subscribing to this channel if the subjects of business, economy, and finance are of interest to you. So let us begin with first talking about the Chinese approach of business. Chinese business presence in Africa is heavily supported by Chinese government, often through state-owned enterprises, which can ensure massive funding for Chinese companies. Chinese companies are known for their large-scale infrastructure projects, from railways and roads, bridges to energy sector. They also dominate in the mining sector, making China Africa's one of the top trade and investment partners. But here's the catch. Chinese approach has often led to African countries accumulating massive amount of debt. Concerns have already been raised about the debt trap, and there is an ongoing criticism about limited job creation and technology transfer into Africa by China. This has left room for Indian companies to take a different and potentially sustainable path. You know the name of the country which has totally fallen into China's debt trap? Do mention in the comments. Indian businesses, on the other hand, are focused on building long-term and mutually beneficial partnerships with the African countries. They prioritize sectors where India has deep expertise, such as information technology, consumer goods, healthcare, and renewable energy. While China builds large infrastructure, Indian businesses aim to build ecosystems and provide solutions to support the local economy. India's trade with Africa was about $80 billion in the year 2023, which is far less than the China's trade with the continent. But what's interesting is the quality of these engagements. Indian businesses are widely viewed as more collaborative and focused on building local capacity rather than just extracting resources or building infrastructure. Let us explore certain specific sectors where Indian businesses are competing against the Chinese companies in Africa and in certain cases even surpassing them. First is information technology and telecom. Indian companies like Infosys, Tata Consultancy Services, and Bharti Airtel are making strong moves in Africa's IT and telecom sectors. Airtel Africa, for example, has grown significantly by focusing on affordable and reliable services across several African countries, competing against Chinese telecom giants of Huawei and ZTE. Indian companies also invest in the local talent, training their professionals in software and IT skills, which builds trust and loyalty in the market. The second sector is healthcare and pharmaceuticals. India is known as the pharmacy of the world, and Indian pharma companies like Cipla, Sun Pharma, or Dr. Reddy's Pharmaceutical Company are providing affordable and quality medicines and healthcare services in Africa. This has a huge impact, especially when compared to the high cost which is associated with many of the Chinese-made medical products. Additionally, Indian companies are also collaborating with various African governments to set up local manufacturing facilities, creating jobs and transferring skills. Third is renewable energy. In renewable energy, Indian companies are focusing on solar power and affordable power solutions. With support from International Solar Alliance, a coalition led by India, companies are setting up solar power plants, bringing electricity to rural Africa and helping African countries in reducing the dependence on fossil fuel. This approach contrasts with China's massive investment in coal and traditional energy projects. Fourth is agribusiness and consumer goods. Indian consumer goods companies like Godrej and Dabur are gaining market share in Africa by catering to local taste and preferences. Meanwhile, companies in agribusiness are helping Africa to improve productivity by introducing efficient farming techniques and tools. This helps African farmers to be more self-reliant and sustainable, creating a market which is less dependent on the Chinese imports. Hopefully, you would have subscribed to the channel by now. If not, please do consider subscribing. One of the most critical advantages that Indian businesses have in Africa is their focus on building local relationships. Many of the Indian businesses in Africa are family owned, like those run by the family members of Indian diaspora who have been part of African communities for generations. This fosters a sense of trust, cultural understanding, and commitment that Chinese companies often fail to match. Indian companies also focus on local hiring and training. For example, African employees are often given leadership roles within the Indian companies, unlike with many of the Chinese companies where the senior leadership is often imported from China. This empowers local communities and promotes a sense of ownership. But of course, it is not all smooth sailing. Indian companies face challenges as they compete against the deep financial resources of the Chinese firms. They must constantly innovate and build strategic alliances and stay consistent with their commitments. However, the long-term approach of building a sustainable, locally integrated businesses is likely to pay off. So what's the takeaway here? Indian businesses are steadily building unique presence in Africa, focusing on sustainable growth, local partnerships, and empowering communities. By creating real lasting values, they are not only competing against the Chinese companies, but also offering African countries an alternative that may better serve their long-term interests. Do you think Indian businesses can continue to create their headway against the Chinese businesses in Africa? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to consistently stay updated on global business trends, strategies, and insights. Meanwhile, you can also write to me on my mail ID, which is mentioned in the description. Be inspired, keep building.